Hi, my friendly auctioneer here with you again, talking about some research we did, golly, 10, maybe 15 years ago. We were studying what people collected, and we eventually started to see a pattern. And here's what we discovered. People age 1 up to about 5 don't seem to retain much of that time period once they age. They're alert, they're watching videos, they're participating in life, but as they get older, the years, 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, those years don't necessarily stick. It occurred to us that about age 6, children started to retain their environment, look around, and it continued age 7, age 8, age 9, all the way up to about 13, where I've kidded with crowds and people for over a decade that once your child turns 14, they know everything, and their brain kind of turns to steel. You can't tell them anything. They know everything. Mom, Dad, leave me alone. I got it all figured out. So generally speaking, from 6 to 13, as they participated in life, they were taking more in than they were pushing out. Their brains were soft and supple and taking in information, noticing what car was in the driveway, noticing what was on the mantle in the living room, the decorative items, the furniture, the collectibles that they were around during those ages, 6 to 13. The other thing we noticed is that people started collecting, seriously collecting, somewhere between the ages of, say, 45, 50, 55, and maybe even 60. But that if there was a prime time, it was about 50 years old. They'd been in their job long enough that they had accumulated some disposable income. They started to attend auctions. They were looking for interesting items. They were walking through antique stores. And what are they buying? Well, remarkably, they were buying things that they were exposed to back when they were 6 up to 13 years old. And if we use 6 to 13 and just kind of an average, 10, and say that 50 is just about average in terms of that person who's actively collecting, looking, shopping, at auctions and otherwise, there's about a 40-year span. And can we notice at auctions what items are bringing a lot of money and what items aren't bringing much money? And can we trace it much of the time? In fact, almost all the time, I think, maybe, we can trace it from, is that item about 40 years old? Collector car auctions. We all remember the 55, 56, 57 Chevrolet. And I say we all remember. We don't all remember because there's a crowd of people that wouldn't recognize a 56 Chevy if they were standing next to one. And why is that? Because there wasn't one sitting in their driveway when they were 6 to 13 years old. There was a 72 Skylark sitting in their driveway when they were 6 to 13 years old. And because of that, they're at a collector car auction today buying that 1972. They wouldn't even notice those 55, 56, 57 Chevys or early 60s cars or even late 60s cars, because that's not what was in their view from 6 to 13 years old. Things that are 20 years old, 30 years old aren't as hot. Something gets into the 40 plus or minus year old range, becomes generally high collectability, interest, a lot of people looking at it, reminiscing. And then when it's 50 and 60 and 70 years old, a lot of times it loses some steam and there isn't as much interest. And in fact, We can attest to that as auctioneers. I think there's probably not an auctioneer in the United States or around the world that hasn't seen what we were selling in the 1980s and maybe early 90s isn't selling for very much today. And what wasn't selling very well maybe 10 years ago is selling really well now. And we sometimes look at that and say, is there a pattern? Is there a rule? Is there some way we can assess what's going on here? And I'm offering to you that those bidders are trying to buy a piece of their childhood back, and they're trying to pinpoint something 6 to 13, average of 10, around 10, about 40 years ago. They're looking back 40 years and saying, oh, my mom had that in her kitchen, or I remember my uncle had that tool in his shop, or I remember the car my parents or grandparents had in the driveway. Lots of times we connect with those items. And here's maybe the last thing that is important for auctioneers to understand, is that keeps changing. This paradigm keeps moving. In other words, it's 2020. Well, when it's 2025, what are people going to be buying? Well, if they're 50 years old in 2025, they're going to be looking back to 1985. And 2030, they're going to be looking back at 1990. And so it's going to keep moving. I've seen some thoughts, some other folks that comment about the auction industry saying, well, this stuff's real low. China, glassware, pottery to some extent. It was extremely hot in the 1970s, 1980s, even 1990s, and is really off now because people 50 years old collecting didn't have those items sitting around their home when they were 10 years old. And it would be a good time to buy those items. I would beg to differ. I'm not sure it's a good time to buy those items, and I'm not sure they're going to come back. Just because something is low priced doesn't mean it's going to go back up in price. I think things generally appreciate up until they're about 40 years old, particularly that last, say, 10 years, and then they start to drop off when they're over 40 years old, and I'm not sure they ever come back. So if you're looking for glassware, statuaries, pottery, silver, crystal items, it's a great time to buy some of that. Or 1955 Chevrolet might be a good time to buy one of those, but I'm not sure you can count on it increasing in value in the future. Interesting study. I find it fascinating what people buy and why they buy it. Our study suggests people are buying back into their childhood. Mike Brantley, Auctioneer, pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for tuning in. We've got other videos here on this same page. Invite you to take a look, and we'll have other videos heading your way.